Okay, seniors, we're going to give this another shot. This is the second time I've recorded this. Had some technical difficulties at first go around, so we're going to try to streamline this as much as possible. So this will be our Chapter 2 lecture, starting at Section 2. We've already talked some about the Constitutional Convention. Again, understand that in 1787, we're going to have a committee of 55 delegates representing 12 of the U.S. states at the time. We're going to meet in Philadelphia with the intention of fixing the Articles of Confederation, okay, our original governing structure of the United States that did not work out for a whole variety of reasons that we have discussed previously. But this Philadelphia Convention that later becomes known as the Constitutional Convention of 1787 is where our U.S. Constitution is going to be, quote unquote, it's going to be created. So these 55 delegates that represented every state in the Union except Rhode Island. Rhode Island did not send any delegates because they did not like the idea of strengthening the national government as a small, fairly unpopulated state. So they chose not to send anybody to this Philadelphia Convention. So the 55 delegates that did attend, that included people like George Washington and Ben Franklin and James Madison, are going to ascend on Philadelphia with the intent of fixing the Articles of Confederation until they realize that, hey, we just need to completely axe this and write a new constitution. So the delegates that did come to Philadelphia were all men. All were fairly well educated. About a third of them were slave owners and could be classified as elitists. Okay, elitists not necessarily meaning that they were all extremely wealthy individuals, but elitists meaning that as far as like social circles and social standing, that they could be elitists. So you remember we talk about our theories on democracy and participation in democracy. We have our elitist theory that basically says, hey, elitists are going to control the government anyways. So keep that in mind here as we go about talking about our Constitutional Convention. One of the many issues that arises here had to do over representation in our national legislature. And this might be the biggest issue that existed is, again, this new Constitution was going to propose strengthening the national government, and a major part of that is a national legislature. Our former national legislature under the Articles of Confederation did not really have much power whatsoever. So our new national legislature that comes to be known as Congress is going to be composed of a bicameral structure with a House of Representatives and a Senate. But how we get there is like this. So James Madison, again, maybe the most organized and excited fellow at this Constitutional Convention, he is going to propose his solution to this issue. He called that the Virginia Plan, or the quote unquote the large state plan. And you see in the notes there that they heart population, okay, in the sense that large states felt like they should have more representation because they made up a greater portion of the population. But this Virginia plan included a little bit more than just an idea for a structure of Congress. Also called for a three-branch system where you have a legislative branch, executive branch, judicial branch, and then the bicameral, right, a House of Congress that representation was based on population. In one house, voters could directly vote in representatives. The other house, the higher house, would have members appointed into it by the state legislatures, okay? The smaller states, i.e. New Jersey, hence the New Jersey plan, headed by William Patterson, or the small state plan, obviously they're going to reject Madison's plan as they favored equal representation. Small states were very concerned about being swallowed up by the large states, especially when it came to matters of legislation. So Patterson's New Jersey plan is going to call for equal representation for every state, regardless of population, and that those representatives would be appointed by the state legislature. Now, again, this disagreement is what almost broke the Constitution from the get-go. Luckily, a Roger Sherman from Connecticut is going to come along with his Connecticut plan, or what becomes known as the Great Compromise, and he is going to kind of take these two proposed plans and mash them together, right? So eventually what happens is we create a bicameral Congress with a House of Representatives where state representation is based on state population, and a Senate based on equal representation regardless of a state's population. So the House now, right, representatives there serve 2-year terms. We have 435 voting members. Every state is guaranteed at least one representative. So to put that in perspective, a state like North Dakota that has about 800,000 people living here, we get one representative. A state like California that has millions of people living there gets 53. Now, every 10 years, we do our census count, and states can either receive more seats or get seats taken away. But understand the permanent size of our House is capped at 435. There have been times in history where North Dakota had more than one representative, but it's been a long time. But again, its population idea is huge in the House. Okay, our Senate, again, every state gets 2 senators, U.S. senators, regardless if it's North Dakota or California. these senators were appointed to the Senate by state legislatures until the 17th Amendment was ratified, and I believe the year was 1913. 17th Amendment changes it so that our senators are now, they get in by a direct vote of the voters, right? Big difference between the senators and the House is that, again, each House is going to kind of have some special powers. Example, the House of Representatives has to hear appropriation bills first, bills regarding the raising of taxes or funds. They also, if they want to impeach, that process has to start in the House. Whereas the Senate, some of their specific powers are carrying out impeachment trials if need be, ratifying treaties, and confirming appointed government officials such as federal judges. But big difference here is that oftentimes in states that have more than one representative, say like Minnesota, these representatives that serve the House or that serve in the House represent a district or a region of a state. So North Dakota has a legislative district. We are just one because our population isn't big enough. But in Minnesota, they have like 10. Where if I run for representative in Minnesota District 7, only the voters in District 7 get to vote on me. Whereas when we're voting on U.S. senators, all the voting members of the state get to vote. Okay, so that's a big difference there. Slavery was another issue that had to be tackled here at the Constitutional Convention, not so much on the issue of morality or right and wrong, but more so on how slaves would be counted in the population, right? Because the North, at this point in time, the northern states were far more populated than the southern states. And so the southern states, when they hear, okay, Great Compromise, it's going to be based all on population, they kind of got a little queasy because it's like, oh, well, the North is going to strongly outnumber us, and then they're going to get rid of slavery. We won't have anybody to work in our fields. So what happens is the southern states agree to go along with the Great Compromise, but they want to know how slaves are going to be counted. Obviously, with the population of African-American slaves in the South at this time, had they counted, quote-unquote, the same towards population as white citizens, then representation amongst the states would have been, close to equal between the most populated southern state and the most populated northern state. But what is decided is because these slaves did not have voting rights or rights really to participate in the government, is what's decided is that they would count as 3/5 of a white citizen. So in other words, 5 slaves counted as 3 white citizens. In the Constitution, the language was very careful. The framers were very intentional about not using the word slave when discussing this 3/5 compromise, and instead they refer to them as, other persons instead of slaves. Again, big outcome of this is it's going to prolong the Civil War for about 80 years. Southern states are feeling like they got a little something because now the playing field as far as the House of Representatives is going to be more so equal or closer to being equal, since that these states could count their slave populations. But again, between the Great Compromise and the 3/5 Compromise, those were two of the bigger issues that had to be tackled here at our Constitutional Convention. Again, Constitution will get ratified eventually in 1788, about a year after or so after the convention dismisses. But a number of themes, we've talked about some of these already, but the Constitution does have the idea of separation of powers very much present, that we're going to have 3 branches of government. Those 3 branches are going to have their own unique powers. Again, this is kind of an idea that is based off the workings of the former French philosopher Baron de Montesquieu, who talked about each branch having a certain power so that one branch should not become all powerful. All right, do not confuse separation of powers with the idea of checks and balances. Checks and balances refers to the idea that each branch of government has a certain power that limits the power of another branch. So, for example, Congress has the power to create legislation. However, the president, as the executive, has the power to check that power or to limit that lawmaking power, because the president either has to sign or veto legislation. Vice versa, the legislative branch has a check on the executive branch, where Congress can impeach the president or vice president, or judges for that matter, judicial branch, for wrongdoings, right? And again, impeach does not necessarily mean remove. Impeach means formally accuse, okay? So those are some examples, again, of how these branches have powers that limit the other branches, and we refer to that concept as checks and balances. One of the big issues at the Constitutional Convention was how much power the states were going to have. The framers made it very clear early on that one of their major intentions was to strengthen the national government. again, take some of the power away from the states, right, under the Articles of Confederation and some of the issues that we'd had there. So the Constitution also includes themes of federalism that we'll talk more about here in Chapter 3, where we are going to split governmental powers between the national government and the state governments. Okay, oftentimes there is some disagreement over what powers belong to the feds versus the states. It's the whole 10th Amendment, all powers not given to the national government reserved for the states, versus like the Supremacy Clause and the Elastic Clause, where, again, Elastic Clause says necessary and proper, all laws can be made that are necessary and proper. Supremacy Clause, that all national laws are superior to state laws or local laws. And this is something that the framers were also intentional about including, because that had been an issue previous with the Articles of Confederation. But we'll talk more about the idea of federalism here next chapter in a later lecture. So our three branches of government, right, starting with our legislative branch. So if we look in our Constitution discussed by Article 1, their primary function is to legislate or to create laws. Our legislative branch in the United States at the national level is headed by a Congress. Congress is made up of two houses, a House and a Senate. We've kind of talked about some of those fine details here on a previous slide. I would understand that there are 435 voting members in the House of Representatives, and that every 2 years, those members of the House, all of them only serve 2-year terms, and every 2 years, all the seats are up for re-election. Whereas in the Senate, we have a total of 100. Each state sends 2 senators to the Senate, and one third of the Senate gets elected every 2 years. So all the seats are not up for re-election at once. The senators serve 6-year terms. I would understand that senators were previously selected by the state legislatures. That changes with the ratification of the 17th Amendment in 1913. Looking at the Constitution, looking at what powers does Congress have, that's oftentimes a question that surfaces. And in Article 1, Section 8, we have what are called the expressed or the enumerated powers, the powers belonging to Congress that are spelled out word for word in the Constitution. So things such as borrowing money, declaring war, establishing roads and post offices, those types of things in Article 1, Section 8, I believe there's 12 of them. Those are the ones that we'd consider the express powers, okay? Now, that last clause or last piece of that last power in Article 1, Section 8 is what we call the necessary and proper or the elastic clause. The wording in Article 1 that allows the national government to stretch their powers when need be, and then we would call those powers the quote-unquote the implied powers, okay, which is oftentimes where you see some of the debate between the states and the national government on the power actually belongs to who. Talk about our executive branch created by Article 2 of the Constitution, includes our president, our vice president, and a big bureaucracy that is not necessarily discussed in the Constitution at all. But our executive branch by far is our largest national branch of any of the three, where it's the president, it's the vice president, it's the cabinet, it is advisors, it is a whole slew of people. Okay, and understand that the only 2 people that serve in the executive branch, the only 2 that are actually elected officials, are the president and the vice president. Their primary function is to enforce the law and to head the executive branch, okay, which is a very big thing. They're also viewed as the head diplomat. They have the title of commander-in-chief. Again, primary function here is to enforce law. And then we have our judicial branch. Judicial branch is headed by our federal courts, and our Supreme Court's the highest court in the United States. Once they make a ruling, that's just kind of the way the rule is until a new case surfaces. The big power that our Supreme Court has, this power is not mentioned in the Constitution whatsoever, is the power of judicial review. That is the power to rule laws or actions to be unconstitutional. That power stems from the ruling in the Marbury versus Madison case of 1803, basically in which there was a federal judge who wanted his judgeship. That judgeship doesn't get delivered, tries to force the government to deliver it. John Marshall says, sorry, I can't. This is all unconstitutional. Hence the principle of judicial review that gets established from that case. So again, you will not see that wording in the Constitution, but what the power of judicial review is the power of the Supreme Court to rule laws or actions to be unconstitutional. The other thing that the judicial branch does is interpreting these laws is they have to interpret the Supremacy Clause in the idea that when national laws or treaties might violate constitutional rights, or when state laws might violate national laws, right? But the Supremacy Clause, what it says is that all national treaties and laws are superior to local or state laws, okay? So we talk about like our civil rights and liberties, something like same-sex marriage. Again, Supreme Court in 2015, marriage historically being a state issue. 2015, Obergefell versus Hodges, Supreme Court says states actually you have to issue marriage license regardless if the couple is same sex or not. That infringes on a couple of our different constitutional amendments and our natural rights. So again, we look at the Supreme Court's role in securing civil rights and liberties. It's a pretty important one that we'll talk immensely about here throughout the rest of the course. There's also an article in the Constitution, Article 5, that discusses amending the Constitution. Again, this is how people kind of hold the government accountable to. Another example, we talk about two-thirds of both houses, three-fourths of all states, Now, mind you, our Constitution has been amended a total of 27 times. 10 of those amendments were added at once. The other 17 come after it. 10 amendments get added right away to the Bill of Rights. There's two ways to go about this. Either there can be a proposed amendment by two-thirds of both houses of the Congress, so two-thirds of 535 voting members. Once they have that proposal, that can then be sent to the state legislatures, assuming that three-quarters or 38 of the 50 state legislatures vote on this, and it passes. We now have a constitutional amendment. The other way we can go about it doing, it's only been used one time, is when we use a two-thirds vote of a national convention. And then followed by a special state convention. But again, two-thirds of both houses, three-fourths of all states. And I'd understand that the one's been used many more times than the other. But again, an example of how federalism works, of how people can hold the government accountable. And the other thing I'd understand about amendments, seniors, is that amendments are meant to be very long-lasting, because you think about the majority that you need to get an amendment added, it's very difficult to do. So it's supposed to be a fairly permanent change. Okay, getting into ratifying our Constitution, we talk about feds and anti-feds. We've read the Federalist Papers a little bit in class, so we understand that the Federalists, John Jay, Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, were those who supported a stronger national government, those who supported the quote-unquote the Constitution. And they write these essays in an attempt to sway people to see the benefits of having a stronger national government. And in their Federalist Papers that we have read, we've read 10 and we've read 51 on factions and branches of government. Again, their biggest arguments and the biggest way that they tried to appeal to people who maybe did not think that this was the right course to take is that they would argue that a national government would secure the nation, not only defensively but also economically. They would also try to appeal to the fear of people that, hey, if we do not strengthen the national government, we allow the Articles to continue, or something similar to the Articles of Confederation, that anarchy could form, or we could be subject to foreign attacks. All right, so those are some of the very brief things. Those that did not believe in this were called the antis, right? The anti-feds, those who opposed the stronger national government for a whole variety of reasons in the Constitution. Biggest reason why, the two biggest reasons, that the anti-feds were more small government. They preferred the idea of states' rights or states' powers, quote unquote, to that of national powers. The other big thing that the anti-feds did not like about this new proposed structure of government was that the Constitution did not originally include a Bill of Rights. And they felt that the government would try to infringe on the rights and liberties of U.S. citizens if that were not included. And that was probably their most effective argument, was the Bill of Rights one. And they said that these large republics would also become ineffective because our politicians would become basically so comfortable in their jobs that they wouldn't actually do anything anymore, and they just keep getting voted in because of name recognition and factions. And they go on to write a series of their own essays, the Anti-Federalist Papers, one of those being called Brutus I, written by Robert Yates, where he expresses a whole variety of concerns about the Constitution, the necessary and proper clause, how large republics are not the answer, how having a standing army could lead to civil unrest, and basically, again, fighting the viewpoint of the Federalists. Okay, now in time what will happen is that the Constitution will get ratified. The way the Constitution was written is that only 9 of the 13 states had to ratify it to get it to go into effect. So now you think about that, well, Mr. Rowe, what about these states that aren't mentioned in the Constitution? Well, as a part of statehood and becoming a state, states agree when they form to follow the Constitution and to adopt the Constitution. So that's kind of the loophole there. But June 21st, 1788, New Hampshire becomes the 9th state needed to put the Constitution into effect. Other states will ratify after. Madison had promised some of these states, i.e. like a Massachusetts, that if they ratified, he would drop amendments for a quote-unquote a national Bill of Rights, which he will keep his word. And in 1791, Madison proposes, I think it was like 20 amendments for this Bill of Rights. Congress, 2/3 of Congress will agree to send 12 of them back to the states. Of those 12, 10 get passed and added to the Constitution as the Bill of Rights, right? Our freedom of speech, our right to bear arms, protection from quartering troops, protection from unreasonable searches and seizures, protection from self-incrimination, guarantees to a fair and speedy trial, guarantees from protection of cruel, unusual punishment, the idea that we have more rights than just those listed in the Constitution. Then we have the 10th Amendment that says all power is not given to the federal government or reserved for the states, right? So that gets added in 1791, and he keeps his word. And again, the Bill of Rights, what I understand is, if we talk about arguments of the feds and the anti-feds, is that the strongest argument the anti-feds had is maybe the fear they created over the lack of a Bill of Rights, despite the fact that many of the state constitutions that were already in place contained one. This was something that was a very pressing issue to them. They were able to get some support for it. Later gets added, and now we have our Constitution. So again, keep those things in mind. Understand that amendments are meant to be very permanent. Only way to get rid of amendments is to repeal it with another amendment, kind of like the 18th and 21st are prohibition amendments, and understanding the difference between the feds and the anti-feds for the time. Okay, but that is where we are going to stop. I'll get this put up. Please let me know if you have any questions, and I hope you enjoy Service Day.